Can organic farming feed the world without synthetic nitrogen fertilizer? That's what I'm going to talk about today in this talk titled The Nitrogen Paradox. I'm Anneliese Abbott, and this is the sequel to a presentation that is already up on my YouTube channel called Can Organic Farming Feed the World? And when I first gave that presentation at the Ohio Ecological Food and Farm Association last year in 2025, someone asked me, what about nitrogen? And so the answer to that question was so long that I am doing an entire presentation just on that. And so it was a valid question because there is this idea circulating that you can't feed the world without synthetic nitrogen. In his book, Enriching the Earth, Vaclav Smil said, without the Haber-Bosch synthesis of ammonia, about 2/5 of the world's population would not be around. And then you have this graph from Our World in Data by Hannah Ritchie, which says that half of the world's population would die basically if they didn't have synthetic fertilizer. You got this really scary graph, like here's the population line here, and then you've got this is the population without synthetic nitrogen, and this is the population with synthetic nitrogen, and then you've got this kind of bumpy looking graph here that almost looks kind of legit. But I decided to look into it. So, because I'm like, something doesn't sound right about this. How do you know? How do you know what percent of the population is fed by synthetic nitrogen and without synthetic nitrogen? It's like, yeah, it looks neat and tidy on this graph, but what's the data that goes into it? And what I've discovered is the only data on this graph that is actually data is the population curve. And even that, we really only know back to about 1950. We don't really know before that because we didn't have good global census of population before 1950. So this graph is actually bunk, and I'm going to explain why. So one thing that I thought was, okay, maybe there is a way to figure out if you look at a nitrogen atom, how it was fixed. So I know that with carbon, for example, people have said you can tell if carbon was fixed by a C3 or a C4 plant based on the ratio of isotopes because different plants take different isotopes. So I thought, okay, maybe it's like that with nitrogen. Maybe the biological nitrogen fixation gets a different ratio of isotopes than chemical nitrogen fixation. So I did some research, and it turns out that's not true. You can't really tell. Some people have tried to use nitrogen isotopes to tell if food is organic or not, but it's not accurate enough. They can't really use that as a diagnostic. So basically, there is no way. You can't take a strand of your hair and run it through a mass spectrometer and figure out what percentage of the nitrogen in your body came from biological nitrogen and how much came from Haber-Bosch. So that graph is not based on that. This argument is only based on the fact that crop yields have increased since the 1950s. And then it's all speculation that that increase in yields was driven solely by nitrogen fertilizer, and that therefore without the nitrogen fertilizer, you wouldn't have an increase in yields. So this is really just the yield argument in disguise. When people pull out this nitrogen thing, I want to point out this isn't really about nitrogen, it's really about yields. But I'm going to talk about nitrogen and yields today. So the real question is actually how much of the increase in yields since the 1950s could have happened without nitrogen fertilizer. And that's something that, data does not really tell us. So what I'm going to talk about today is, first of all, I'm going to talk about the nitrogen cycle. I'm going to talk about the troubled history of synthetic nitrogen fixation and how it wasn't really quite as altruistic feeding the world as people like to make it sound. I'm going to explain why there's not a static limit on biological nitrogen fixation. And then I'm going to talk about how organic farmers can manage nitrogen without synthetic fertilizer, a few basic guidelines. So first of all, why is nitrogen important? Nitrogen is important because you use nitrogen to make proteins, and everybody knows proteins are important. That's the big push now. You must eat your proteins, and proteins are essential for life. All life must have proteins. You have proteins to build your body. And it's made out of amino acids, so you can't live without proteins. In fact, plants, animals, and humans are about 3% nitrogen. Most of that nitrogen's in the form of proteins. So where do we get these proteins from? Now this picture is misleading because it's got meat prominently, animal products prominently featured, but the reality is that all of our proteins initially come from plants. If you're eating animal proteins, the animals got those amino acids they used to build those proteins from plants. So all of the proteins that we eat, whether we get them from animals or plants, they originally came from plants because animals cannot synthesize their own amino acids. Only plants can. So what plants can do, so here's a protein, here's an amino acid. You see it's got nitrogen in it. Only plants can make amino acids, and they make them from ammonia and nitrate. So ammonium and nitrate are the two chemical building blocks that plants can use to make amino acids. But where does the ammonium and nitrate come from? Well, ultimately, it comes from the atmosphere. So nitrogen is different than other elements like phosphorus or potassium that we mine out of rocks. There aren't, well, I'll explain in a minute, like why there is something you can mine, but not much. So nitrogen is not like that. Nitrogen actually is from the atmosphere. And so here's the good news, is we are never, ever, ever going to run out of nitrogen because the atmosphere is 78% nitrogen. You're swimming in nitrogen right now, no matter where you are on Earth, inside, outside, whatever, you're breathing nitrogen. The air is just full of nitrogen. So there's never going to be a shortage of nitrogen. But there's a catch. And the catch is that that nitrogen is inert. So the nitrogen in the atmosphere is what we call dinitrogen. It's two nitrogen atoms and they're stuck together with this triple bond. And a triple bond is one of the strongest chemical bonds in nature. It doesn't react with anything. Nitrogen is completely inert. You breathe it in, you breathe it out. It is not changed at all. And plants actually cannot react this molecule to make it into nitrates or ammonia. They can't do it. Plants can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, they can take water out of the atmosphere, they can take oxygen out of the atmosphere, but they can't do anything with the nitrogen any more than we can. The only organisms that can take that dinitrogen and turn it into ammonia and then into nitrates are bacteria. And they have this really cool enzyme called nitrogenase. So the nitrogenase enzyme has got a little bit of molybdenum in it. And it is really amazing because it is the only thing that can fix dinitrogen into ammonia at atmospheric temperature and pressure. Synthetic nitrogen fixation uses extremely high temperatures and extremely high pressures, but the biological enzyme doesn't need that. The only thing special it needs is an anaerobic environment. It also needs a lot of energy. It takes 16 ATPs to fix one, or two, actually it's two, 16 ATPs to make two ammonia molecules. And so that's why there's not like nitrogen fixation happens, but they're not going to fix more than they need because it's really energy intensive. So these bacteria, they live free in the soil. Some of them do. There's always some nitrogen fixation going on in the soil. But again, they have to have that anaerobic environment and it takes a lot of energy. So more nitrogen fixation, at least for agriculture, comes from this really cool symbiotic relationship between plants only of the legume family. So not every kind of plant, but only legume plants and a certain type of bacteria, the rhizobacteria. And so there's this really cool chemical pathway where the bacteria send out signals, the plants send out signals, the bacteria infect the root hairs, and then the plants grow these nodules, which are actually a combination of bacterial and plant tissue. And so these nodules are part of the plant, but they're full of bacteria, and those bacteria are fixing nitrogen for the plant, and in return, the plant is giving them sugars so that they have energy to fix the nitrogen. And one thing that's really cool about these nodules is that, remember I said that it needs an anaerobic environment to work. And so if you cut open one of these nodules on a soybean or a clover or an alfalfa, you can do this in the summer, cut it open, it's going to be like moist and pink, and it looks a lot like blood. And there's a reason for that, because that pink color actually comes from a molecule called leg hemoglobin, which is very similar to the hemoglobin in blood. And it serves the same purpose because the hemoglobin in blood carries oxygen. The leg hemoglobin in nodules binds up that oxygen so that it doesn't poison the nitrogenase enzyme. So this is really cool. This is how it happens. But again, this is an energy intensive process. And so in nature, nitrogen is conserved pretty well. You've always got fixation going on, both free living bacteria and the ones that are living on legume roots. And then when those plants die, then or they're eaten by animals and animal waste and all that goes back into the soil, it's broken down by decomposing organisms back into ammonium and nitrates. And then those nitrates are taken up by plant roots. And so most of the nitrogen in a natural balanced system is constantly cycling. And then a little bit of is always lost. So you have denitrifying bacteria. They use nitrate as an energy source because remember all that energy it takes to make it. If you turn that back into atmospheric dinitrogen, that releases that energy. So that's what the denitrifiers do. And you've always got some fixation going on. So the natural nitrogen cycle, biological, has got a lot of recycling. A little bit comes in, a little bit goes out. That's how it works. And I want to point out that all life on Earth before 1880 was supported by this biological nitrogen fixation. So you think about like the great old growth forests, the massive rainforests. You see all this green in this picture? That is all leaves. That's all photosynthetic material. And everywhere that you've got green with the chlorophyll and photosynthesis is going on, you have rubisco. Rubisco is a protein that's just full of nitrogen. So we sometimes think of forests as they don't have any nitrogen because trees are very woody. Well, the trunk of the tree is, but that tree has a huge number of leaves. So there's a ton of nitrogen here that was fixed all by biological processes. You have the bison on the Great Plains, all of those huge animals, they got all their protein from the grasses. This is all biological. And then you have agriculture, like traditional Chinese agriculture. When F.H. King went to China in 1909, he estimated that they were growing enough food per acre to feed 6 people. And if you calculate that out, so if every currently used acre on Earth that is arable, that we use for agriculture already, not clearing new land, the land we already use for agriculture, if we managed every acre of that as intensively as the Chinese did before the modern era, using all biological processes, we could feed 21 billion people at the same standard of living that they had in China. So that's, when they say, oh, you couldn't feed the world with that. No, there was a lot of biological nitrogen fixation going on. And all agriculture relied on that biological cycle. So they did that with leguminous crops. You plant leguminous crops. You rotate those legumes with other plants. They returned organic waste to the soil, keeping that recycling going because it's always much more efficient to keep recycling that nitrogen than to lose it and have to refix it all. It's much better to keep it cycling. And so you can compost organic waste that gets that nitrogen back in the system, back in the soil. Manure, same thing, that's nitrogen the animals ate going back into the soil. And even when they first started the commercial fertilizer industry, so there's a difference between commercial fertilizer and synthetic fertilizer, because like the slaughterhouses would have all their blood and bones and all that stuff. They'd make that into fertilizer and sell it. That was commercial, but it wasn't chemical. It was biological fertilizer. It was still from organic materials. It was just sold commercially. And the same thing when they first started wanting to find something in a bag that had nitrogen in it. They found these islands off the coast of Peru, the Chincha Islands. And the Chincha Islands were the nesting place of all these seabirds who ate fish. And so generation after generation, those seabirds nested on these islands and they pooped a lot. And so these islands were like this giant mountain basically of seabird poop. It was really gross and really stinky, and it was really good fertilizer. And so that was the first commercial nitrogen fertilizer, but it was still natural. So we're still completely in the natural cycle, even when they started selling guano. And then they discovered that there was some inorganic nitrates in the Atacama Desert of Chile. Now, these were also created by biological nitrogen fixation because there were the free-living bacteria in the desert, and they fixed nitrates. And for some reason, because it was so dry there, nothing else can live in this desert because they're so dry. There's barely any rain. And so the nitrates did not leach. They didn't get used by other organisms, and they just piled up. There were all these huge deposits of sodium nitrate in the Atacama Desert. And so when the guano ran out around the 1870s or 1880s, they started mining the sodium nitrates from Chile instead. Now, the sodium nitrate is not really a very good fertilizer because in addition to the nitrate's great, but then it's got all the sodium, and sodium's not good. You get too much of that, your soils turn saline, and that's not good at all for plants. It stunts plant growth. So this was not as good of a fertilizer as guano. But nevertheless, the supply was limited. So people started to worry. Right around the turn of the century, they're like, wait, but someday we're going to mine out all of these nitrates, because that's what happens with mining. You always mine it out at some point, then there's none left. And then what? And so that's where you have William Crookes. He was the president of the Association for the Advancement of Science. And in 1898, he gave a lecture in which he said, England and all civilized nations stand in deadly peril of not having enough to eat. As mouths multiply, food resources dwindle. It is the chemist who must come to the rescue of the threatened communities. It is through the laboratory that starvation may ultimately be turned into plenty. And so what he's saying here is that, look, we're going to run out of those nitrates in the Chilean desert. And so what are we going to do then? We've got to figure out some way to fix atmospheric nitrogen without using bacteria. Do this with chemical and methods and physics and engineering. We've got to figure out some way to do this synthetically without depending on nature. And so at first glance, this sounds really altruistic, and that's how it's quoted in these books that are saying, oh, this synthetic nitrogen feeds the world. And if you read all of Crookes' speech, and it's available online, you can read it, you'll discover that he's actually pretty racist. So his reasoning for why we needed more nitrogen wasn't that he necessarily thought you wouldn't be able to grow any food. He just thought maybe you wouldn't be able to grow wheat. And he's like, well, the reason that England and Europe are superior to the other countries is because we eat wheat, and those people who eat rice or corn or whatever are inferior races because they eat inferior grains. And so the idea was like, in order for Europeans to keep their dominance of the world, we must keep eating wheat, and therefore we must have enough nitrogen fertilizer to keep growing wheat. So there was that. Then there was something else too. So later on in the speech, he says, the exhaustion of the world's stock of fixed nitrogen means not only a catastrophe little short of starvation for the wheat eaters, but even the extinction of gunpowder. The fixation of nitrogen is vital to the progress of civilized humanity. Now you may be wondering, gunpowder? Huh? But exactly. Okay, so this nitrogen shortage, let's just say that fertilizer was not the only reason they started mining those Chilean nitrates, because nitrate also is an essential chemical to make explosives. Because you know how it takes so much energy, like I was saying, to fix that. Well, the reverse is true. You react nitrates, it's a reaction that creates a ton of energy immediately in an explosive kind of way if you design the reaction to do that. And so nitrates, potassium nitrate, along with charcoal and sulfur, is what they use to make black powder. And so yeah, during the Civil War, they would be mining caves down south to try to get some calcium nitrate from the bat guano and turn that into potassium nitrate. And it was easy enough to switch out the sodium for potassium in those sodium nitrates and make explosives. And then, of course, they developed other kinds of explosives like nitroglycerin, the nitro, that's nitrogen, nitrates, and then all the other explosives they developed, they all had nitrogen as a starting point. They all used nitrate to help them explode. Were peaceful uses. You had mining, for example, or blasting tunnels for railroads. You could say there were peaceful uses for explosives, but let's be honest, one of the main reasons that they developed these was for war. And the reason countries were concerned about it for national security, they weren't really talking about food security, they were talking about weapons. And therefore, it's not really surprising that the ones who finally figured this out, who made that breakthrough, who figured out how to synthetically turn atmospheric dinitrogen into ammonia, were in Germany. So we started out with Fritz Haber. He was a German chemist. He's the one who first figured out the chemical reaction on a laboratory scale, pretty small scale. And then this other guy here, Karl Bosch, he's the one who made it commercially viable. Built the first nitrogen fixing plant, Haber-Bosch plant, they call it. It's the Haber-Bosch process because it was Haber and Bosch who developed it. So the Haber-Bosch process built this factory in Germany just in time for World War I. And so the first thing they used this nitrogen for, it was not feeding the world. It was not even feeding Germany. They were using it to make explosives. And some historians estimate that because they were able to fix nitrogen synthetically to make explosives, that extended World War I by at least 2 years. Because otherwise Germany would have run out of nitrates and couldn't have made explosives, and they would have had to surrender. So before any of the synthetic nitrogen was used to grow one little crop, it was used to kill a whole bunch of people and blow up buildings and all that good stuff. So Then, of course, after the war, all the Allies swoop in and they're like, oh yeah, we stole all the technology. So by World War II, everybody knew how to do this to make the Haber-Bosch process. In the United States, they opened 10 large, the government funded the construction of 10 large Haber-Bosch nitrogen fixing plants during World War II. And of course, at first, all of that nitrogen went into weapons. So all of those explosives they used in World War II, you see the pictures of them bombing all of the cities on all sides, bombing everything. And even the atomic bomb, they would not have developed the atomic bomb if it hadn't been for all those conventional explosives. First of all, there were conventional explosives in the atomic bomb that pushed the two pieces of a nuclear material together, but then also they wouldn't have even had this idea of making a bomb if they hadn't made so many other bombs with nitrogen. So yeah, you can indirectly say that the Haber-Bosch process made it possible to invent the atomic bomb too. So all of that. But then of course the war finally ended. And so after the war ended, they didn't need all of that nitrogen for explosives, fortunately. And so the government declared these plants surplus. And so they either gave them away or sold them to chemical companies real cheap. They did not charge them the cost of production. And so the companies now have these functional factories, and all it cost them to fix nitrogen was the cost of the inputs and the energy. They didn't have to pay the construction costs. So that meant that they could sell the synthetic nitrogen really cheap in the 1950s. And so that's when farmers really started using synthetically fixed nitrogen, was in the 1950s, after the war, after that these plants were now declared surplus. So the question. So what they will say is they'll be like, okay, so after the war, now these are statistics, these are facts. So after the war, nitrogen use quadrupled. So we've got here 1960, they were using about, I don't know, 3 million tons of nitrogen fertilizer. Up to about 1980, we're more around 12 million tons. So yeah, quadrupled. At the same time, yields of corn tripled. So, well, then they didn't triple over the time. They've tripled since then. So since then, we've had corn yields, 1960, somewhere around 50 bushels per acre, way up to like 180. So maybe actually that's like more than 3 times. That's almost 4 times increase in yields here. So you've increased them almost at the same rate. And so they'll be like, see, nitrogen went up, corn yields went up. That's why. And you couldn't have had that increase in yields without the increase in fertilizer. But I want you to notice something. So this graph here, first of all, notice the slope of these isn't the same. This one goes up a lot steeper. This one's a lot shallower. But the other thing is that this one goes up real steady until about 1980, and then it basically levels off. I mean, it goes up and down, up a little bit, but the nitrogen fertilizer doesn't increase after 1980. But when you look at the corn yields here, they go up till 1980. Guess what? They keep going up and up and up and up and up and up and up. And so, okay, fertilizer use isn't increasing, but yields are. Then maybe it's not the fertilizer. It's not, or the fertilizer might be part of it, but it's not the only thing. And so what else could be playing a role here? So it turns out there are a lot of factors that affect crop yields. As any plant scientist will tell you, plant breeding is one major thing. You can breed plants to have higher yields, and this was definitely done starting in the 1930s. So if you look at these graphs, the USDA has been collecting this data on crop production and yields ever since the 1860s for major crops like corn or wheat. So corn, back 1866 through 1936, you see yields stayed pretty much stagnant, and then they started going up, 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 up. And the same with wheat. They stayed real stagnant, 1860s to 1930s, and then up, 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 up. And so in the 1930s, this was when plant breeders first developed hybrid corn. And hybrid corn had much higher yields than open pollinated corn. So that was part of it. That was part of with corn, especially wheat. It wasn't really until the 50s that they worked on the breeding, and you can see that the wheat curve doesn't really take off until the 50s. So that's something there. Another thing was row and plant spacing. So if you ever look at any of these real old pictures of farmers back in the 19th century or even the very early 20th century, they often planted corn in what they called the check row system. And that meant that they had the same spacing not only between corn rows, it was like 18 inches to 2 feet, but also between hills of corn in each row. So you had these hills of corn spaced really far apart so that they could cultivate it both directions. They could go one way and then they could go at right angles, go the other way to cultivate it. And that was great for keeping down weeds. weeds, it left a lot of bare soil and probably contributed to soil erosion, but there were very few plants per acre. So nowadays they plant corn much more densely. There's a ton more plants per row, and there are a ton more rows. The rows are closer together. So you're going to have higher yields per acre just because you have more plants per acre. Even if each plant is producing the same amount of corn, just if there's more plants per acre, your yields per acre are higher. Another thing that really happened, especially starting in the 1930s, was the abandonment of marginal farmland. So all of these graphs are averages. And everyone knows that with an average, some of the numbers that went into that are going to be lower than the average and some are going to be higher. And so with American farmland, there was a lot of land that was rocky, hilly, marginal, where they had really low yields. And that got abandoned for farmland, for farming by the starting in the 1930s. It just went back into forest or whatever. It was not still used to grow farming. So when you take out all those low values down at the bottom and then you redo the average is going to go up, even if the good farms aren't producing any more, just because those poorly producing farms aren't pulling down the average. So that's part of it when it comes to averages. Another thing that they don't like to talk about is the soil conservation movement. So back in the 1930s, it was really bad. You had the Dust Bowl, the soil's literally blowing away. In the east, you had soil erosion by water, where these gullies are just washing the soil away. No fertilizer is going to help with that. Like, fertilizer does you no good when your soil is washing away. And so by stopping that soil erosion, keeping the soil in place, they could double yields within a year or two just with that, with soil erosion measures. Because guess what? When the soil is not eroding away, then you can grow more on it. So that was a huge contributor in increase in yields. And then of course you notice these graphs are not like perfectly straight. They fluctuate, up and down and up and down and up and down. And that's because yield in a given year is influenced by the weather. It's influenced by water, either too much water, like a flood, or not enough, a drought. Both of those can hurt yields, pest diseases. So that's why it fluctuates. You've also got nutrient availability. Just because there are, fertilizers or whatever, are those available to the plants? That can vary. And then you have the nutrient density of crops. So one of the ways that they triggered these really big increases in yields, especially in the corn, was by breeding the plants to produce more starch. So yield is always measured in either weight or volume. And so the two things that'll really build up your weight and volume really fast are starch and water. For a grain like corn, it's mostly starch. For vegetables or fruits, they bred them so that they were bigger, but all that bigness was just a lot more water. There weren't really more solids, more sugar, or more nutrients in it. And so the nutrient density of crops, like the protein content of corn, drastically declined. If you were to draw this graph based on the amount of protein per acre instead of bushels per acre, it would still go up, but it would go up at a lower rate. It'd probably look more like that because the protein content of these varieties of corn is only about half of the protein content of these varieties that they were growing. So when you're talking about actually feeding people or even animals, you don't want a ton of starch. That's great if you're making ethanol, which is what they do with most of the corn. So fine, I suppose. But when it comes to actually feeding animals or people, you want more protein, you want more vitamins, you want more minerals. And all of those there was less of as the yields go up, because the yields go up just with starch and water. So that's part of it too. And then, of course, there are all the downsides of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer that the advocates don't like to talk about, the people who say it's feeding the world, because the reality is between 50 and 70% of the nitrogen fertilizer they put on fields, it does not go into the crop. It is washed off of the fields. So they're actually only so if they calculate how much nitrogen is in crops based on the amount of fertilizer implied, no, most of that doesn't actually go into the crop. It runs off into the surface water. And then you have this nasty phenomenon called eutrophication. So eutrophication comes from the Greek word that means to enrich. And so you get like lakes and rivers, streams, whatever, are usually what we call nutrient poor. They don't have a lot of extra nitrate in their ecosystem. So when all this nitrate and phosphates also run off into a body of water, then the bacteria, the algae that photosynthesize are just like, nutrients, this is great. And they start growing and they photosynthesize a ton, and you get all this thing called an algal bloom, which, looks gross. And then what happens is that there's too many algae, they crowd each other out and they start to die. And then there's so many dead algae down in the water that the decomposing organisms trying to break that down, they suck up all the oxygen out of the water, and then the fish die because the fish can't breathe. It's because fish need dissolved oxygen in the water to breathe. So you would think that, well, fish eat algae, this would help the fish, but no, there's too much. The poor fish suffocate, and then you have all this dead fish and dead algae, and I'm sorry, that's not feeding the world. That's just gross. And then you have groundwater. So if nitrates leach down into the groundwater, then you pollute the wells with nitrates. And this is less of a problem for adults because we can metabolize a certain amount of nitrate. Too much is still toxic, but babies can't do that. Babies are very sensitive to nitrate poisoning, and they will turn blue and die if they have too many nitrates. And so this was actually happening. A lot of babies died from their mothers mixing up formula with well water that was contaminated with nitrates. And the ones that breastfed their babies were okay because the human body doesn't put the nitrates into the breast milk. So that was safe, but it was the mothers that were feeding their babies formula, and some babies died before they finally figured this out. And they're like, oh, don't use the tap water to mix with formula. So it's like, sorry, that's not feeding the world either. And then you have other problems. So if you put on too much nitrogen and it's not balanced with your other nutrients, then the plants will grow really fast. They'll put out this, thick, lush green growth. But because it's not balanced, then they suddenly become really attractive to pests. And so the insects and diseases will just move in. And then guess what? You got to use more pesticides or whatever. So it increases the susceptibility to pests. And then you also have this problem. If there's too much nitrate, sometimes the plants will take up more than they can fix into proteins. And they'll just store nitrate in their leaves, which doesn't hurt the plant any, but it does hurt animals or people that eat those plants because those nitrates are very toxic. So again, that's not feeding the world either. That's just making people sick. But then they'll say, yeah, well, okay, too much nitrogen is a problem. We just got to be more judicious, but we still need it to feed the world because biological nitrogen fixation doesn't fix enough nitrogen. So let's look at that argument. Remember, like I said earlier, biological nitrogen fixation is a very complex process and it uses a lot of energy. So plants and bacteria are just like people. They are frugal. So if let's say you had somebody gave you a whole bunch of free food already made, all you had to do was pull it out of the fridge and eat it. Are you going to go out to the store or even a restaurant and pay money for food when you have all of this free food that somebody just gave you? Most of us would not. Most of us would eat the free food first before we went out and bought other food. So it's the same with plants. So these legumes are like, okay, I'm not going to give all these sugars to these bacteria to fix nitrogen if I can just get free nitrogen from the soil. So bye-bye bacteria, you're on your own. And the bacteria are like, yeah, whatever, we're not going to bother to fix nitrogen either because we can just get it from the soil, so why waste the energy? So it doesn't actually kill the bacteria, but they stop fixing nitrogen, and the legumes don't make as many nodules because they don't need to. So fertilizer stops biological nitrogen fixation. Like I said, it doesn't kill the bacteria, but they're not fixing nitrogen. So if you could measure how much nitrogen is fixed by bacteria versus fertilizers, yeah, there's not much biological nitrogen fixation going on in a synthetically fertilized field because they're not fixing nitrogen because they don't have to. However, when there is not extra nitrogen, it can start back up. So this is reversible. When you stop putting on the fertilizer after a period of adjustment, the biological fixation will kick back in, but it takes it a little while to get that going again. So there's not like any kind of set limit on biological nitrogen fixation. They'll make it sound like there is. It's not. Bacteria multiply exponentially, way faster than humans, that's for sure. So, and of course, there's an unlimited amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere. So really, it's just a matter of how much energy they're willing to devote to fix nitrogen, and they're going to fix as much as they need, but they're not going to fix extra. You don't find extra nitrates just laying around in nature, except in the Atacama Desert, but that's very unusual because nature is conservative. It keeps only the amount of nitrogen you need because, as I just pointed out, extra nitrate is bad. It causes eutrophication. It's toxic. It's explosive. There's nitrate by itself isn't a great thing, and so in nature it's always bound up in something else, and so you don't have too much free nitrate because that's not good for anybody. So again, remember, all life on Earth relied on biological nitrogen fixation before 1880. So it works. And so, but then they'll be like, but the population growth. See, there were only 2 billion people until about 1950, and now there's 8 billion. So there are 4 times more humans on Earth. Therefore, we need 4 times as much nitrogen, right? Wrong. Because guess what? We are only when you talk about nitrogen, we're not talking about we're talking about the total amount of biomass on Earth, because humans only use some of the nitrogen. So how much do we actually use? How much does our population matter? So biomass on Earth, plants make up 80% of all biomass on Earth. And that's pretty obvious. You walk outside, look around, you realize there are plants, some kind of plants, pretty much everywhere. So 80% of all biomass on Earth is plants. And that hasn't, 80% of all biomass on Earth before 1880 was plants. Same today. There are certainly not more plants today than there were then. Another 15% is the bacteria and fungi. These guys here, yeah, they're 15%. Again, I don't think there's more bacteria and fungi today than there were then. There may be different, different shifts in species composition, but there's not more of them. And then animals, all animals, and this includes insects and fish. So all the life in the ocean, all the life on Earth, all the animal life is only 0.5%. That skinny little red sliver there is all the animals. So that's all of the biomass that's in animals. And then what about us? Well, I couldn't even put it like I entered it into PowerPoint, but you can't even see the graph because it's too small to see visually, because humans are only 0.01% of all the biomass on Earth. So I divided out this whole pie here is this slice here of the animals. So then this is of all the animals, and then there's us. And that teeny little bit of the animals, so that small of a pie of that small of a pie. And so the thing is, nobody says that Earth's biomass has increased since 1880. Some people say it may have decreased a little bit with deforestation and everything else. So that means there's not more fixed nitrogen in biomass today than there was before synthetic nitrogen fixation. Yeah, there are more humans, but although we are important when it comes to how we shape the Earth, as far as the nitrogen that is actually in our bodies, it's such a tiny, tiny percent that it makes no difference that the human population has quadrupled. When it comes to the ability of biological nitrogen fixation to supply nitrogen, it's irrelevant. We really are not that important when it comes to fixed nitrogen. So that's why this population argument doesn't hold water. It's irrelevant. The human population has there's 10 billion people. If there were 20 billion people, it would still make no difference when it came to fixed nitrogen, because most of the nitrogen is not in us, it's in the plants and the fungi, bacteria, and the animals. And then we eat some of them, but we really only eat a fairly small percent of them. We like to think that we are so important, but when it comes to nitrogen fixation, nitrogen fixation was sufficient before we developed it. There's no reason it can't be now. So yeah, there's no any kind of ecological reason that we can't fix way more nitrogen than we need using biological systems. So how do you do that? And this is, of course, the fundamental of organic farming, is to recycle the nitrogen. Because remember, I showed you with that graph, in nature, there's always some fixation going on. There's always some loss from denitrification, but most of the nitrogen gets recycled because that's the most efficient way to do it. And so in all organic waste contains some nitrogen because all organisms contain nitrogen. And so the idea is you decompose those organic wastes. And when bacteria and fungi break down those wastes, then they can release some ammonia and nitrate for the plants, and you keep that cycle going. So the idea of organic farming is to return as many organic wastes to the fields as possible. That will also build organic matter, and it does sequester carbon. So in all the talk about carbon, we've kind of forgotten that carbon and nitrogen are always tied together in organic waste. That is both. So when you're building organic matter, you're building your soil carbon, but you're also building your soil nitrogen because they go together. Humus, soil organic matter has got nitrogen tied right in with that organic matter. So but there is different ratios of carbon to nitrogen, and this is where people sometimes get tripped up, because if you have a plant waste that has way too much carbon and not enough nitrogen, the microbes use the carbon for energy, but they need nitrogen to build their own biomass. And so if there's not enough nitrogen in the plant waste for them to build their biomass, then they're going to scavenge nitrates and ammonia from the soil, and they're going to use those to build their biomass so they can eat the carbon and break break it down. Now, what that's going to do is it makes those unavailable for plants. This is called immobilization. The nitrogen is not gone. It is not lost from the system, but it's unavailable because it's tied up. And so because the plants can't get it, they're going to show symptoms of nitrogen deficiency. And the things that usually cause this are corn stubble, straw, wood chips. Those all have a very high carbon-nitrogen ratio. So the nitrogen will eventually be released, but it's going to be too late in the season for the plants to really grow well, and they're going to be stunted, and that's going to hurt yields. So this is what you want to avoid, is putting on too much of these high carbon wastes all at once. So the way you can avoid this is you can make compost. What composting does is it mixes together high carbon and higher nitrogen waste outside of the soil, breaks them down. So all that decomposition happens before you put it in the soil, so that by the time you apply the compost, the decomposition is complete, the microbes are happy, and they're releasing nitrogen, which then your plants can take up. So composting is one solution. If you can't compost, you need to make sure that the ratio of carbon to nitrogen in the organic waste on your field is more around 30-1. And how do you do that? So crop rotations, this is one way, including forage legumes. So a lot of farmers, the only legume they use is soybeans. Now soybeans they are a legume and they fix nitrogen, but it's mostly goes into the grain. There's not a lot of it left. And so soybeans don't really add nitrogen. You really need the forage legumes, things like vetch. And so like this vetch and rye cover crop, this is the one that Elliot Coleman uses. On his farm, he grows some amazing crops here like lettuce. I highly recommend his new book, The Self-Fed Farm and Garden by Elliot Coleman. He talks about how he does this, and I've been to his farm, and it is amazing. He has extremely healthy crops. He doesn't bring in any outside fertility. He grows it all himself using cover crops and green manures. So cover crops and green manures are big. And then also manure. If you have animals in your rotation, this is how it's traditionally been done, especially if you just planted a crop with a lot of carbon in the residue like corn, or you got straw from your wheat. If you mix manure with that, that will help keep that carbon nitrogen ratio low enough that it doesn't tie up the nitrogen. In pastures, you want to plant legumes in your pasture mix. Like I said, plants that need a lot of nitrogen and they need it right away, compost is a good way to help with that. And in a good organic system, you should not need soluble nitrogen. I know there are organic soluble nitrogen fertilizers like fish emulsion or whatever, but again, in nature, you don't see much soluble nitrogen. It's usually slowly released by the decomposition of organic matter. And so the goal in organic farming should not be to rely on soluble nitrogen of any sort, even organic. It should be to keep that nitrogen cycling so that the soil microorganisms release it to the plants at just the right time for growth. And this can be done, and there are a lot of farmers who are doing that. So then they're going to come up with this argument. Again, they're going to be like, yeah, but even if you do that, your yields are going to be lower, so you can't feed the world. So this again is not necessarily true. In the 1940s, organic yields, farmers consistently got double their conventional neighbors because they weren't doing good nitrogen cycling at all. And so, yeah, organic yields went up. Those yield curves I showed you, the yields of organic crops have followed those same curves ever since the 1950s because, like I said, nitrogen is not the only thing that's contributed. Plant breeding, closer crop spacing, abandonment of marginal farmland, all those things organic farmers have also benefited from. So organic yields have followed that same rate up as conventional yields. They won't tell you that. They'll say they're back in the 1920s. They're not. Organic yields have followed that same rate going up. So different studies have different conclusions. Organic yields can be higher, they can be lower. This here is data from the USDA 2021. They only do these surveys like every 5 years, so this is the most recent one we have. As you can see, the US average organic yields are a bit lower than conventional yields, and that's the same for some states like Colorado or Kansas, but when you get to Washington here, the organic yields are way higher than conventional yields. So it can be done, and there's a lot of this is what we need to work toward is understanding like why are they higher, why are they lower, what can we do about it. One thing that is not always taken into account in comparison studies is that when you first transition a field that's been under intensive chemical use to organic farming, you cut the chemicals. It's sort of like a drug addict suddenly stopping cold turkey. They go into withdrawal, and the soil kind of goes into withdrawal because it was so dependent on these synthetic fertilizers, and yields are going to drop initially. So you'll have a couple bad years, and that makes a lot of people discouraged, and they say, see, it doesn't work. It does work. It just takes time for the soil microbiome to build back up and to get that biological nitrogen cycle going again. It takes several years, usually about 3 to 5. By 5 years, if you're adding all this organic matter and stuff, usually you've got the yields back up to where they were before, and everything is so much healthier. But there's that transition period, which is why we need to eventually transition all of our farmland to organic, but we need to not do it all at the same time, because you're going to have that. So we need to stagger the transition so that we don't have a huge yield drop all at once, but that's temporary and you get past that. Another thing to point out is yields are not everything. And so, like I said earlier, the way they've gotten those really high yields in corn is to breed them to produce more starch and less protein. So that's not really positive. If you're making ethanol, sure, but if you're feeding it to animals or you want to eat it yourself for human food, there's not really any point in having higher yields when the yields are just starch and water. So if the organic crops have a bit lower of a yield, but they have a higher nutrient density, you've got just as much protein, minerals, and vitamins, even if the volume or the mass is a little bit smaller. If that mass and volume was just water, what's the point of that? You don't need nitrogen fertilizer to get water. You can just drink water. So that's something to consider as well. Again, there's lots of benefits of not using synthetic nitrogen. First of all, you're saving money and energy. 2 to 4% of global energy or global carbon emissions goes into the Haber-Bosch process. Now, we're not going to eliminate all of that by going organic because, as I pointed out earlier, the Haber-Bosch process really wasn't developed for fertilizer. It was developed for nitrates, especially for explosives. The world's not going to stop using nitrates for other purposes. They will still use it. However, farming does not have to be dependent on that. And natural gas prices are cheap at the moment. Eventually they will go up. At that point, organic farming will be much cheaper. You're also not contributing to the methamphetamine crisis. I don't know about everywhere, but here in Michigan, this is a problem in rural areas. People will steal anhydrous ammonia from farms because it's an ingredient they use to make methamphetamine. And so if you don't have an anhydrous ammonia tank on your farm, it's not your fault when the house down the road blows up. It's also, like I said, not polluting the surface and groundwater. It increases pest resistance because the plants can grow. Normally, they're not shooting up too fast and unbalanced with nitrogen growth. It benefits soil life because you're working with that natural system. You're working with that natural process instead of overwhelming it. And that's the way that you can continue it, and it can be indefinitely sustainable. So if you have any questions about this presentation and want to see more, please go to my website, historyoforganic.com. You can contact me. You can sign up for my blog. So thank you very much.